Welcome to the episode. I'm Elena Marlowe. Tonight we walk slowly into one of the strangest and most haunting unsolved crimes in German history, the Hinterkaifeck murders of March 31st, 1922. We'll keep this calm and evidence-driven, focusing on what the documents show, what neighbors remembered, and why the case resists a tidy answer.
I'm Lukas Reinhardt. Good evening. We'll look at the facts: who lived at Hinterkaifeck, the odd signs that something was wrong before the killings, the timeline of March 31 to April 4, and the unsettling possibility that the murderer stayed on the farm for days. Sound good, Elena?
Yes, Lukas. Let's begin with the place. Hinterkaifeck was a small, isolated farmstead in Bavaria, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, between Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen. The name simply means behind Kaifeck, because the farm sat behind a tiny hamlet called Kaifeck, cut off by woods and fields. The isolation matters very much.
Right. In 1922, post-First World War Germany was under the Weimar Republic, with huge economic strain and social unrest. People in rural areas often kept cash at home, distrustful of banks. Communities were tight, rumors traveled fast, and an unfamiliar person on a path would draw attention. That context helps explain why certain objects, like a newspaper no one ordered, stood out.
The household itself, 6 people. Andreas Gruber, 63. His wife, Cecilia, 72. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35. Victoria's daughter, Cecilia, 7. Victoria's son, Josef, 2. And a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, who arrived the very day she was killed. The family dynamic and backstory are central to many theories, so we need to treat them with care.
Exactly. Andreas had a reputation locally as harsh and domineering, and there was a prior criminal conviction for incest with his daughter Victoria, an important, deeply damaging fact in the records. Victoria had been married to Karl Gabriel, who reportedly died in World War I, and the paternity of young Josef was disputed, another painful element woven through the case.
So we already have layers: a remote farm, a history of abuse and scandal, and people who knew each other intimately. That combination changes how you read a footprint in the snow or a newspaper left on the porch. But let's step through the odd signs that alarmed neighbors before the murders, because those details are what make Hinterkaifeck feel like a story that had been unfolding long before March 31st.
One of the earliest red flags was the testimony of a former maid, Crescence Rieger. She worked there from November 1920 to September 1921 and quit because she heard noises in the attic and felt as if someone was moving about above the house. She left before the murders, but her statements are a first clear sign that something or someone had been on the property earlier.
There's also that newspaper. In March 1922, Andreas reportedly found a Munich newspaper on the property, one he did not remember buying, and nobody in the hamlet subscribed to. The postman denied delivering it. Small object, big implication. Either a stranger had been there, or someone with connections outside the farm had been present.
And then the footprints in the snow. Days before the murders, Andreas told neighbors he'd found footprints leading from the forest to the farm, to a door with a broken lock into the machine room, tracks that did not return to the forest. That was followed by reported footsteps in the attic that night. He searched and found nothing, but crucially, he didn't report it to the police. That reluctance to involve authorities is part of the pattern.
Which raises so many questions. Was there someone hiding on the property? Did Andreas think it was a prank? Or did shame and family dynamics prevent an official complaint? We can't know his inner reasoning, but the physical facts are clear. Footprints, a missing key, noises in the attic, and later, a new maid arriving on March 31 who would be among the victims.
Let's set the immediate timeline. Maria Baumgartner arrived on the afternoon of March 31st, escorted by her sister, likely the last outsider to see the family alive. That evening, like any rural household, they would have done chores, fed livestock, put lamps to bed. Sometime late that night, or in the early hours of April 1st, the murders occurred. The exact hour is unknown. Now, Elena, can you walk listeners through how the murders likely unfolded?
Yes. Forensic reconstruction suggests the 4 adults and the 7-year-old were lured into the barn one by one. Andreas, elder Reed Cecilia, Victoria, and the little girl, and murdered there, stacked and partially covered in straw. Then the killer is believed to have entered the house and killed 2 people inside, Josef, the 2-year-old in his bassinet, and Maria, the maid, in her bed. The weapon was a mattock, a pickaxe-like farm tool belonging to the family, later found hidden in the attic during demolition.
Important to note, Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller performed the autopsies on April 5th in the barn. He found heavy blows to the head were the cause of death. He also noted that the 7-year-old little Cecilia had been alive for hours after the attack and had torn out tufts of her own hair while lying in the straw, an awful detail that speaks to prolonged suffering rather than instantaneous death. We'll keep it non-gory, but it matters to the reconstruction.
It does. And there's the question of how they were lured to the barn. Official notes say noises from restless animals called them out, but later examinations suggested sounds in the barn couldn't actually have been heard from inside the house, so that explanation is weak. Alternative possibilities: someone used a voice that was familiar to the family, or the killer manipulated something right outside to draw them out. None of these are provable, but they're plausible given the context.
And then comes the element that haunts historians and criminologists. The murderer appears to have stayed. The bodies weren't discovered until April 4 days after March 31, and multiple signs point to someone remaining on the property. The animals were fed, bread and meat were eaten, smoke was seen from the chimney, and there are reports of mail being taken in. That behavior makes Hinterkaifeck distinct from an attack followed by flight.
Yes, the evidence that someone stayed is slender but cumulative. 2 coffee sellers visited on April 1st and were met with silence. They noticed the machine room gate open and left. A mechanic worked on a machine on April 4th for 4.5 hours without seeing anyone. Neighbors noticed the family missed church and the child didn't go to school, unusual and alarming. But it was only when neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer sent his children to check, and later went himself with others, that the bodies were found.
The discovery itself is distressing because of early contamination. Neighbors and curious locals walked through the site before investigators properly secured it. Some moved the bodies. At least one person cooked a meal in the kitchen, destroying potential trace evidence. That failure to cordon off the scene and preserve it was a critical loss for the investigation. Elena, what were the immediate investigative steps taken once authorities arrived?
An investigative team from Munich, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber, took the case. Autopsies were done on April 5th by Dr. Aumüller. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further analysis. Those skulls were later lost or destroyed, likely during World War II bombings. Forensics at the time were limited. Fingerprints were not systematically taken, and much of the site evidence was already compromised by people moving through the property. Small decisions made early on constrained what could be known.
There were later discoveries during demolition in 1923. The bloody mattock was found hidden in the attic, and a penknife was found in the hay. Those finds are significant, but by then so much time had passed that they couldn't be leveraged to identify the killer. The initial theory of robbery was quickly abandoned when investigators found large amounts of money in the house, apparently untouched, undermining a simple theft motive.
which pushes us toward a personal motive. The intimacy of the location, the lack of theft, the time the killer may have spent on the property, all point to someone who knew the family, or at least someone driven by motives beyond money. That's why so many suspects in later years were neighbors, ex-employees, or people with prior grievances, people who had reason to be familiar with the farm and its routines.
Let's walk through the major suspect theories, one by one, carefully. First, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had been involved with Victoria and had recognized Josef as his son in civil terms, though paternity was disputed. Why has he long been considered a prime suspect?
Schlittenbauer's actions and proximity raised suspicions. He was one of the people who discovered the bodies. Witnesses later reported he entered the house and unlocked the front door from the outside as if he had a key. He also moved bodies and tampered with the scene, according to some accounts. He made later comments that seemed to reflect insider knowledge, remarks about the ground being too frozen to bury bodies properly, for example. All of this fed long-running suspicion.
Counter-arguments are important. Schlittenbauer had no clear history of violence, and he later successfully sued people who accused him. He won slander cases. As a neighbor, he had deep local knowledge, so some of his comments could have been informed guesses. The 2007 re-examination by police cadets did single out a main suspect privately, and many commentators believe that was Schlittenbauer, but the cadets did not publish a name in deference to descendants. So the evidence remains circumstantial.
Then there are the Gump brothers, particularly Adolf, a former Freikorps member, suspected of earlier killings in Upper Silesia. In 1922, he was named as a suspect, and in 1951, a sister allegedly gave a deathbed statement naming Adolf and Anton as the perpetrators. How solid is that link, Lucas?
Not very solid. Adolf had a history of organized violence, which made him plausible on the surface, but there is no direct evidence tying him to Hinterkaifeck, no motive, no proven presence at the farm, and by 1951 the statement is hearsay decades after the event. Adolf died in 1944, and the deathbed accusation is legally weak without corroboration. It's an evocative theory, but the documentary support is thin.
Another name that comes up is Peter Weber, accused informally by a former co-worker who recalled Weber speaking knowledgeably about the Grubers and even suggesting violence in 1919-1920. But I believe the records show nobody could place Weber at the farm in March 1922. So again, a plausible motive, but no firm link. Then we have the Bickler brothers and Georg Siegel, people who had worked at or with the farm and knew where tools were kept.
Correct. Anton and Karl Bichler had some ties to the farm. Anton helped with harvests. Georg Siegel had worked at Hinterkaifeck and even admitted to carving the handle of a mattock kept on the farm. Former maid Crescence Rieger suspected this trio. She said Anton once remarked the family ought to be dead, and she believed the dog's reactions suggested familiarity with certain individuals. But again, the money left in the house weakens the pure robbery hypothesis, and these accusations remain unproven.
The Thaler brothers emerge in certain testimonies. Rieger said she once saw Josef Thaler and another man at her window, asking where family members slept and remarking the Grubers had money. They were known for petty crimes in the region. But as with the others, there is no conclusive link placing them at the scene during the relevant days. The trail runs cold because the crime scene was compromised and records lost.
One of the more dramatic theories that Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, did not really die in World War I and came back as the killer is emotionally compelling but poorly supported. Some rumors and prisoner-of-war stories suggested sightings, but contemporaneous soldiers testified they identified Gabriel's body in 1914. There's no documentary evidence that he returned alive and committed the murders.
It's a story that fits a narrative of revenge, but not the archival facts.
Bill James's theory from The Man from the Train also gets mentioned. He posits a serial killer named Paul Mueller was responsible for multiple family annihilations at isolated farmhouses in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The pattern, isolated homes, families wiped out, blunt farm tools used, bodies stacked, matches Hinterkaifeck in several ways. But James himself calls it a toss-up. There's no direct evidence linking Mueller to Germany, much less this farm. So it's an intriguing pattern theory, but circumstantial.
All of the suspect lists have something in common. Plausible narratives built from fragments, local testimony flavored by rumor, and gaps where modern evidence would have helped. This is why investigators in 1922 and subsequent decades never charged anyone. The case was officially closed in 1955. There were interrogations as late as 1986. And that 2007 student re-examination, helpful but ultimately private, left the public with no named perpetrator.
Let's zoom back to the killer stayed element, which is the episode's central unsettling hook. Evidence that someone remained includes animals being fed, food eaten from the pantry, smoke from the oven seen on nights after the murders, and reports of a man with a lantern confronting a passerby. Taken together, it suggests the perpetrator lived with the corpses for up to 3 days. That's rare and deeply disquieting.
From a forensic psychology perspective, staying at the scene, especially in a domestic context, can have several explanations. One is practical necessity. Shelter, food, and knowledge of the farm made it a refuge. Another is an assertion of ownership or entitlement, remaining as if the property were now theirs. A third is a form of dissociation or control, where the killer normalizes the atrocity by blending into the victim's routines. Any of these fit parts of Hinterkaifeck's evidence. None can be proven conclusively.
And importantly, this wasn't typical serial killer behavior of striking and fleeing. The person who stayed would have had to carry out routine tasks, tend animals, and possibly take care to avoid drawing attention while still behaving as if they belonged there. That implies either a knowledge of the family schedule that allowed them to go unnoticed, or local trust that made their presence less alarming. Again, that points back to someone known to the area.
Let's talk missed opportunities. The scene contamination we mentioned earlier was enormous. Neighbors moved bodies, people cooked in the kitchen, and items were disturbed. The skulls were sent to Munich and later lost or destroyed in WW2. Fingerprints were not systematically taken. If modern forensic protocols had been applied, careful sealing of the scene, preservation of biological material, this case might look very different today. This is as much a case study in investigative fragility as it is a crime mystery.
It's also a study in how social dynamics, the shame of incest, the gossip of a small community, and the inertia of rural attitudes may have contributed to both the tragedy and the failure to solve it. Victoria reportedly tried to speak to Lawrence Schlittenbauer about Josef's paternity, and there had been an earlier incest conviction. Yet Andreas remained the patriarch. That silence, that stigma, might have prevented threats from being reported or taken seriously.
Another thread worth emphasizing is the numerous strange sightings that were never fully reconciled. A pair of figures at the forest edge the night after the murder. A man with a lantern who blinded a passerby before disappearing. And a stranger in 1927 who allegedly claimed responsibility and fled into the woods. Each of those accounts is tantalizing, but none furnished conclusive leads. They become part of the mythology of the case, eerie moments that amplify the mystery but don't solve it.
We should also note how investigatory decisions, however well-meaning, created permanent gaps. Allowing the mechanic to repair equipment on April 4 without confirming the family's well-being, neighbors walking through the site, and the delayed arrival of the Munich team combined with the insufficiency of contemporaneous forensic science to produce an evidentiary vacuum. The loss of the skulls later in World War II compounds that vacuum. It's a cascade of small failures with lasting consequence.
The cultural aftermath is interesting too. The farm was demolished in 1923. Locals found it morbid and were tired of curiosity seekers. A concrete memorial was erected near the site, and the victims are buried with a monument in Weithofen. The case-inspired books, setting and circumstances are cinematic. Snow, an attic, a newspaper no one ordered, and the idea that someone stayed.
Yeah. There's an archetypal quality to the story that makes it linger. But at its center were real people. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia, Joseph, and Maria, whose lives and deaths were entangled in shame, secrecy, and rural economics. We must keep the victims at the forefront and avoid turning them into props in a mystery. Every speculation about suspects should be measured against the sources.
Eleanor, one analytical angle I find useful is contrasting trust and proximity. Many of the plausible suspects were not strangers, neighbors, ex-employees, romantic partners. In a small rural community, that proximity amplifies the horror. It's not an unknown face from the woods, but perhaps someone the family saw at church or artlessly passed on the path. Which is more frightening, someone unknown in the dark, or someone you bowed to at the pew?
That's a powerful point. The case forces us to confront the idea that violence often happens where intimacy, authority, and shame intersect. Another angle is the psychology of staying, how that behavior is not just pragmatic but symbolic. To stay in the victim's home, to feed their animals, to burn things in the stove, suggests an attempt to erase a boundary or seize control. Or it could be a practical way to blend in long enough to avoid suspicion. Either reading is chilling.
Let me ask you, Elena, given all the suspects and the pattern of evidence, which theory feels the most supported by the documents alone, without fiction, without sensationalism?
Carefully, the documents most strongly point to someone local with access and knowledge, someone who could move through the farm without immediate alarm, and who had motive anchored in personal relations, like a paternity dispute, jealous resentment, or long-running anger. If I had to state a cautious inference, it would be that a neighbor or someone close to the family is likelier than a random itinerant attacker. But that's an inference from the pattern. The preserved facts don't allow a definitive naming.
I'd agree. A local person with knowledge of the property best fits the staid behavior and the lack of theft. Schlittenbauer fits that profile in many ways. His role as a discoverer, the alleged key, the relationship with Victoria, and later suspicious remarks, but indicting him requires leaps not warranted by the available evidence. The 2007 cadets may have privately favored a single suspect, but without public disclosure, was stay within the bounds of the documented record.
Right. It's tempting in true crime to want a neat answer. Hinterkaifeck resists that impulse. Instead, it asks us to hold uncertainty and to read carefully the archival fragments, witness statements, and the social fabric of rural Bavaria in the early 1920s. Lucas, what do you think the case teaches modern investigators?
Several lessons. First, the imperative to secure a scene immediately to preserve fragile evidence, something that was not done here and which likely cost us the truth. Second, the need to interrogate social context. Stigma, local grudges, and interpersonal dynamics can shape both motive and reportage. Third, that pattern recognition, like the Paul Mueller hypothesis, can be useful, but must be balanced by documentary rigor. Hinterkaifeck is both a cautionary tale and a prompt to improve investigatory habits.
And on a human level, it teaches restraint, not rushing to name a perpetrator when the evidence doesn't support it, not amplifying rumors that can harm living descendants, and remembering the victims as people. The cadets in 2007 chose not to publish a name for that reason. I respect that restraint. It's a rare act of moral caution in a field that sometimes values closure over accuracy.
Before we close, we should touch on lingering, evocative details that trouble people. The attic noises reported by the earlier maid, the missing key, the newspaper, the man with the lantern, and the idea that someone read or burned newspapers in the oven. These small anomalies add atmosphere, but also are legitimate clues. They show how a pattern of small, odd facts can point to a larger reality, someone's presence on the property long before the bodies were discovered.
Yes, those quotidian oddities are telling. A missing key suggests prior access. A newspaper that shouldn't be there suggests an outside contact. A maid who felt watched and then left, that's a red flag long before the headline. Combined, they establish a sustained threat, not a sudden, isolated act. That's why historians keep returning to Hinterkaifeck. The crime is embedded in a longer story of secrecy and neighborly relations.
We have to resist sensationalizing, but we can appreciate the case as a study in human behavior. How shame and secrecy can hide abuse, how small rural communities police themselves, how investigative lapses can fatally erode truth. It's also a reminder of the limits of evidence and the weight of ambiguity. Sometimes history won't offer us a full answer.
We'll leave listeners with a few points to consider. 1. The evidence suggests the killer was likely local or familiar with the farm. 2. The behavior of staying after the murders makes Hinterkaifeck particularly unsettling and suggests motives beyond robbery. And 3. The combination of scene contamination, limited forensics, and lost material means the case may never be solved to the standard we, today, would expect.
If you're interested in reading more, primary documents and testimony transcriptions are collected on sites like hinterkaifeck.net, and there are English summaries on sources like Wikipedia that compile the timeline and suspects. But I'd encourage anyone who delves deeper to prioritize primary statements, the maid Riga's testimony, the neighbor accounts, and Dr. Aumüller's autopsy records over rumor.
Before we wrap, Lucas, any final reflection on the emotional resonance of this case? Why does Hinterkaifeck still haunts us a century later?
Because it combines ordinary domesticity with profound violation. A family home, farm animals, a kitchen oven, church-going neighbors becomes the scene of atrocity. Then add the idea that the murderer didn't flee, but instead used the house as shelter. That contradiction of the domestic and the monstrous coexisting creates a lingering psychological unease. It's not only a puzzle, it's a breach of the basic trust we place in our living spaces.
Beautifully said, Lucas. For me, as a historian, Hinterkaifeck is also a reminder that archival silence, what isn't recorded, can be as meaningful as what is. The missing key, the lost skulls, the silent oven, they're absences that shape the story. We'll probably never know precisely who killed the Grubers and why, but we can keep examining the evidence with care and respect.
We've traveled slowly through the facts tonight, honoring documentation over gossip. If you want to continue this quietly with us, we'll include references to the main sources in the episode notes, so listeners can read testimony transcripts, the 2007 review coverage, and the timeline assembled from archival material. Anything else, Elena?
Just gratitude to the victims and their families, to the archivists who preserved testimony, and to listeners who prefer careful inquiry over sensationalism. Thank you for sitting with this story. We'll be back with another historical case, analyzed with the same care.
Thank you, everyone. Stay curious and cautious about the stories that survive.
Good night.